way to God.
Is the presence of the other essential?
I've been looking at Sir Richard Southern's famous biography of Anselm, which is really quite fine. And he suggested at one point that actually Anselm was perhaps more suited by temperament for the life of a hermit, or the contemplative who would maybe come in every now and then on the weekend, as it were. But and that I think that may be right. And so, while in theory, of course, he thinks that communal life of that sort is important, I think it's important in ways that in which the communal nature of the communal life falls out. Al?
So Anselm seems wildly enthusiastic about duty. And at one point, one quotation you had from him was something like, God ought to make something or other orderly with the world. I think the world was sort of presupposed there. It wasn't actually in the quotation. But anyway, my question is, does he think God has duties? And does he think, if God does, that God acts out of duty rather than out of love?
There's a whole paper. Actually, there are two papers in answer to that question, I think. So I'll try to give you the short version. He wants to say this: there are true statements of the form "God ought to X," or "it is incumbent upon God that He X," or "phi," or whatever you like. But we can't interpret those as ascribing to God any sort of duty or obligation. God is a debtor to no one, but everything is indebted to God, as he likes to say. So we have to find another way of interpreting those statements that doesn't make God subject to anything other than, you might say, the necessities of his own nature. So what we end up with is a theory of modality that is intended to accommodate that, a semantic theory that's intended to accommodate that, and in particular a kind of perspectivalism that Sanders is working out that I don't understand at all myself, on which statements with modal words, obligation words, and a few others will have varying truth values, not just depending on the context of utterance, which is pretty uncontroversial, but depending on the ways in which they're evaluated. So there's a whole big theoretical apparatus that lies behind that expression, unfortunately. And I mean, whether you will find it convincing in the end, I'm not so sure. But I take it that the short answer is there are things that God must do, that God necessarily does, but we shouldn't think of that, Anselm says, as God's being constrained in some way to do something or compelled in some way to do something.
Let me make a suggestion.
Yes?
Your title, Unruly Wills and Affections, seems to me very good as a sociological description of the social class that Anselm inhabited in that time and place. These are people who are disorderly, violent, impetuous, and they sin daily on a scale that our bland, small society can't even really imagine. Anselm seems to be the ancestor of all those English schoolmasters who believe that if you relax one moment with the boys, they will rape the housemaids, burn the house down, and proceed to march into town and assault the townspeople and take all their property.
Yes, that's exactly the attitude. Yeah.
Generally, those schoolmasters are exactly right. They are the counterpart of that kind of society. Now remember, the Norman French are Vikings at one remove. And what they really are, Vikings with more firepower. And they are very nasty indeed. Well, I rather like them, but they're rather nasty indeed. I take it that Anselm is absolutely intelligible in this respect. This is a society in which the only viable way of proceeding is to impose rules and not allow any infractions to happen at all. And if anybody asks you why you should obey the rules, you slap them down by telling them the rules are there and for them to obey. And I take it if you put it in sociological context, this isn't odd at all. And the remarks that he makes to Gunhilda, this seems to be exactly the sort of way you would have to talk in a society in which everybody professes to be a Christian and nobody is chaste.
Yes, a lot of that seems quite right. In fact, that he, particularly when he's getting advice from his bishops to to be more relaxed, to be more concessive. I take it that one reason that he thinks that will not work is if you give people an inch, they'll take an L. And these people, I mean, when he talks particularly about the unchastity of priests, it is such a scandal. Although he does show just a little bit of forgiveness, in a sense, or understanding that talking about sodomy in particular, he says, up till now the sin has been so common that nobody realized that it was serious. But I'm telling you now that it's serious, and it will stop from henceforth. And not just the sodomy, but long hair. And he's very explicit. No, it's exactly because long hair, it's a temptation. And so he says, from here on out, no priest with long hair is allowed to go into the church. And I take it that you're right, because there is a sense of being on the precipice of absolute chaos, because you see everyone around you who, as you say, is professing Christ and not, in fact, living a Christian life. Yes.
Namely, that we shouldn't treat Anselm's moral theory as competing with other more sophisticated moral theories, but as being something that is, as it were, iron rations. This is what you fall back on when nothing else will do. So if you put it in social context, it becomes intelligible that you should extract from Christian moral theology just this. I mean, it seems to me at this point Anselm becomes intelligible, which, if you give an account out of context, becomes unintelligible.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Bob.
I was quite interested in your contrast between Anselm and Aristotle. At one point early on, I was reminded of the important passage in which Aristotle says something to the effect that an action that expresses virtue must be performed under three conditions. The agent has to know that the agent's performing it, do it for its own sake, and do it from a firm and unchanging character. And you stressed in line with this that Anselm wanted us to do what we ought because we ought. And you also said strikingly at one point that for him rationality just is the ability to distinguish right from wrong, which struck me as rather narrow in that rationality is concerned with other things as well, I suppose, matters of logic, matters that aren't normative. So in any case...
He does actually say in one place the true from the not true.
Okay, well that's a little more like it, I would think.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering whether he had a moral epistemology that allowed him to take it, that we have knowledge of right and wrong independently of going through scripture or religious experience. Because he did not say, according to you, that we should do what's right because it's God's will, whereas the way Gene was putting the problem, he ought to have said that, and that's how he often comes off. So I'm trying to probe his moral epistemology and look at whether he had a way of grounding the will in matters of the right that doesn't have to go through theology.
In a bit that I skipped since I was running along, I talk about that just a little bit. It seems to me that there are quite a number of beliefs that one might have that would be sufficient to meet the belief component here. So you might believe of a given action that it's right, that it has the property of rightness, or some such thing. You might believe of a given action that it's what your superior commands. You might believe of a given action that it's God's will, that action be done. You might believe of a given action that Scripture expressly commands it, for example. I think any of those beliefs would be enough to have what he calls awareness of rectitude. And that sort of awareness of rectitude is pretty minimal.
He wouldn't allow that you could believe an act to be wrong, maybe know it to be wrong because it's the killing of a child, just on that ground?
Oh, that's a useful question. I'm inclined to say no, just because of the austerity of his outlook. There is a wonderful letter that's basically, so your children are all dead. People die. Now, procuring the death of someone deliberately is obviously more serious still, But is merely knowing, as it were, a purely natural description under which the act falls sufficient for knowing the moral description under which it falls? I'm inclined to say no, but I don't think I have any good argument for that. Yes?
Remember the passage where he asks about, is killing wrong because God commands it? Or is it wrong? Or is it just wrong?
There is that bit, right? It's just unfitting.
He knows that
Yeah.
he argues that killing is wrong because it's inconsistent with God's nature. And that's, you can just, because God's nature is life and truth. And
But the question still remains, though, but can you know just... because if you describe it simply as, say, the killing of an innocent, can you know just from that description that it's wrong without bringing God into it?
Yeah, that point could be ontological and not epistemological.
Exactly.
That's what you're bringing in.
Right. And I'm inclined to read that as ontological myself. I don't know about you.
yeah, probably you can know.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, we do have refreshments outside, so please join us there. Thanks, Thomas.